Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Now, you might be thinking you know about powerful Roman women, maybe Cleopatra or Boudicca, but let me tell you something that will blow your mind. Livia didn't need armies or dramatic suicide scenes to change the course of history. She did something far more dangerous. She played the long game, and she played it better than anyone before or since. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one woman managed to control the most powerful empire on Earth from behind the scenes. And trust me, the method she used will shock you. But here's what makes this even more incredible. I've spent months diving deep into ancient sources, archaeological evidence, and the latest historical research to bring you the real story, not the Hollywood version. We're talking about primary sources from Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dios, combined with modern archaeological discoveries that have completely changed how historians view this remarkable woman. Plus, I've created a free downloadable timeline of Livia's life that you can grab from the link in the description, complete with all the key dates and political moves we'll be covering. Picture this. It's 39 BCE, and Rome is tearing itself apart. The Republic is dying a bloody death, and three men are carving up the known world between them like a particularly violent game of Risk. Mark Antony controls the East, Lepidus holds Africa, and a young man named Octavian, barely in his 20s, is desperately trying to hold on to his piece of the puzzle in the West. The streets of Rome run red with the blood of prescription lists, where today's ally becomes tomorrow's severed head decorating the forum. In this chaos, most people are just trying to survive. But not Livia Drusilla. While others cower behind locked doors, she's making calculations that will echo through history. She's 19 years old, married to Tiberius Claudius Nero, and already pregnant with her second child. By every measure of Roman society, she should be invisible, a footnote in someone else's story. Roman women weren't supposed to have political power. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't even speak in the Senate. They were meant to be silent, obedient, and decorative. But Livia had other plans. Her husband, Tiberius Nero, wasn't just any Roman citizen. He was a former prior, a man of significant political standing. But more importantly, he had picked the wrong side in the civil wars. He had supported Mark Antony against Octavian. And now that Octavian was gaining the upper hand, the Nero family was in serious trouble. We're talking about the kind of trouble that ends with your head on a spike and your property confiscated. So when Octavian's forces closed in, Tiberius Nero did what any sensible Roman would do. He ran. He packed up his pregnant wife, his young son, and whatever wealth he could carry, and fled Italy entirely. They ended up in Sicily, then moved to Greece, living as political exiles, dependent on the charity of Mark Antony. For most women, this would have been the end of their story, relegated to a life of comfortable obscurity in some Greek villa, watching their husband's political career crumble into dust. But remember, We're talking about Livia Drusilla. Even in exile, even pregnant and vulnerable, she was watching, learning, calculating. She understood something that most people missed about the nature of power in Rome. It wasn't just about military strength or political alliances. It was about perception, influence, and the ability to make yourself indispensable to the right person at exactly the right moment. The opportunity came in 39 BCE, when a general amnesty allowed the exiles to return to Rome. Octavian, now calling himself Caesar after his adoption by Julius Caesar, was consolidating his power. But he needed legitimacy. He needed the support of old Republican families, the kind of ancient bloodlines that gave weight to his rule. The Claudian family, Livia's family, traced their lineage back to the earliest days of the Republic. They were exactly the kind of allies Octavian needed. But here's where the story gets interesting. At a dinner party, because apparently even in ancient Rome, the most important political deals happened at social gatherings, Octavian met Livia. She was still married to Tiberius Nero, still carrying his child. But something electric happened in that room. Ancient sources tell us that Octavian was immediately captivated, not just by her beauty, but something deeper, something more dangerous, her intelligence. Now, what happened next would be scandalous by today's standards, and it was absolutely shocking by ancient Roman standards. Octavian wanted Livia, and Octavian was used to getting what he wanted. But this wasn't just about desire. This was about politics, power, and the kind of strategic thinking that would define the next 40 years of Roman history. You see, Octavian was already married to Scribonia, a politically advantageous match that had served its purpose. She had given him a daughter, Julia, but the marriage was cold, functional, and ultimately disposable. Scribonia was from an old family, but she lacked something that Octavian desperately needed as he transitioned from warlord to statesman. She lacked the kind of political acumen that could help him navigate the treacherous waters of Roman high society. Livia was different. Even in their first meeting, she demonstrated the kind of quick wit and political understanding that impressed the future emperor. She didn't just make polite conversation. She engaged with the political issues of the day. She asked intelligent questions about policy, about the challenges facing Rome, about Octavian's vision for the future. In a world where most women were expected to discuss household management and children's education, Livia was talking strategy. But here's what makes this moment so crucial to understanding Livia's character. She wasn't just responding to Octavian's interest, she was cultivating it. Every ancient source that mentions this first meeting emphasizes her composure, her dignity, her ability to be both alluring and untouchable. This wasn't a woman being swept off her feet by a powerful man. This was a master manipulator recognizing the opportunity of a lifetime and seizing it. The logistics of what happened next tell us everything we need to know about Livia's political instincts. Octavian divorced Scribonia on the very day she gave birth to Julia. The timing wasn't accidental. It was calculated to send a message. He was cutting ties with the old political order and embracing something new, something represented by his connection to Livia. But Livia was still married, still pregnant with another man's child. In any normal circumstances, this would have been an insurmountable obstacle. Roman law was clear about marriage, divorce, and the legitimacy of children. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Livia wasn't dealing with normal people. She was dealing with the most powerful man in Rome, a man who was rewriting the rules as he went along. What happened next was a masterclass in political theater. Tiberius Nero, Livia's husband, agreed to divorce her so she could marry Octavian. On the surface, this looks like a man being bullied into submission by a more powerful rival. But dig deeper, and you'll see Livia's hand in the negotiations. Tiberius Nero didn't just agree to the divorce. He actively participated in the wedding ceremony, giving Livia away as if she were his daughter rather than his former wife. This wasn't humiliation. This was political genius. By participating in the ceremony, Tiberius Nero was signaling to all of Rome that this wasn't a case of a powerful man stealing another man's wife. This was a voluntary political alliance sanctioned by all parties involved. It legitimized what could have been seen as scandalous behavior and transformed it into statesmanship. And Livia, barely 20 years old, pregnant with her second child, managed to orchestrate her own transition from political exile to the most powerful woman in Rome in less than a year. She didn't just survive the chaos of the late Republic, she thrived in it. In 38 BCE, ended every potential disaster into an opportunity. The wedding was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Livia was visibly pregnant with Tiberius Nero's child, a fact that should have made the marriage impossible under traditional Roman customs. But Octavian had the College of Pontiffs, Rome's religious authorities, issue a special ruling that the marriage was acceptable because the gods had given their approval through favorable omens. Think about the audacity of that move. Octavian was essentially having the religious establishment rewrite the rules of marriage to accommodate his political needs. But more importantly, think about Livia's role in making this happen. She didn't just passively benefit from Octavian's power. She actively participated in creating the religious and legal framework that would allow their union to be seen as legitimate rather than scandalous. 3 months after the wedding, Livia gave birth to her second son, Drusus. By law, the child belonged to her former husband, Tiberius Nero, but by politics and proximity, he became part of Octavian's extended family. This created a unique situation, where Livia's children from her first marriage became stepsons to the most powerful man in Rome, instantly elevating their prospects and creating a complex web of loyalties that would define imperial politics for decades to come. But here's where we start to see the true scope of Livia's long-term thinking. She didn't just marry Octavian for immediate protection or advancement. She married him with a plan that would unfold over the next 40 years, a plan that would see her sons positioned as potential heirs to imperial power. Even though they had no blood relationship to the Julian line, from the very beginning of her marriage to Octavian, Livia understood that her primary challenge wouldn't be winning his love or even his respect. It would be positioning herself and her family for the succession crisis that was inevitable in a system where power was personal rather than institutional. The Roman Republic was dead, everyone knew it, but what would replace it was still being determined. Livia intended to make sure that whatever came next would benefit the Claudian line, her line. This is where Livia's story becomes not just fascinating, but genuinely revolutionary. She wasn't content to be the emperor's wife, a ceremonial figure who attended state functions and managed household affairs. She wanted to be the emperor's partner, his political equal, his co-ruler in everything but name. And incredibly, she succeeded. Within 5 years of their marriage, sources tell us that Octavian was consulting Livia on major political decisions. She had her own correspondence with foreign dignitaries, her own network of informants throughout the empire, her own political agenda that she pursued with methodical precision. Roman senators who wanted access to Octavian quickly learned that the path to his ear often ran through Livia's reception rooms. But this wasn't just about influence, it was about intelligence. Livia had something that Octavian desperately needed as he transformed himself from military commander to political leader. She understood the social dynamics of Roman high society in a way that he focused on military campaigns and political alliances simply didn't. She could read the subtle signals that indicated shifting loyalties, identify potential threats before they became dangerous, and cultivate relationships that would be crucial for long-term stability. More importantly, she had a quality that was absolutely essential in the snake pit of Roman politics: patience. While Octavian was known for his quick temper and impulsive decisions, especially in his younger years, Livia was calculating every move with the precision of a chess grandmaster, thinking 10 moves ahead. This partnership became even more critical as Octavian began his transformation into Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The title itself was a masterpiece of political theater, suggesting reverence and respect rather than the naked power that the word king would have implied. But behind this careful rebranding was a woman who understood better than anyone that perception was everything in Roman politics. Livia didn't just support Augustus's transformation, she helped architect it. When foreign delegations came to Rome, they found themselves dealing not just with the emperor, but with an empress who could discuss trade routes, military strategy, and diplomatic protocols with equal facility. She became the acceptable face of imperial power for aristocratic women who might have resented taking orders from a former general, but could respect guidance from someone who spoke their language and understood their concerns. But here's where Livia's story takes a darker turn, and where her reputation as the Serpent Empress really begins to take shape. Because influence and intelligence were just the foundation of her power. What made her truly dangerous was her willingness to eliminate obstacles that stood in the way of her family's advancement. The first hint of this came with the mysterious deaths that began to plague the Julian family line. Augustus had no sons with Livia despite decades of marriage. This created a succession crisis that would define the rest of their reign together. Augustus had only one child, his daughter Julia, from his first marriage, and Roman law was clear that women couldn't inherit imperial power directly. The succession would have to pass through the male line, which meant Julia's sons or Augustus's adopted heirs. Now, Augustus began adopting potential successors with the methodical approach of someone building a dynasty. First came Marcellus, his nephew, who married Julia and seemed destined for greatness. Young, charismatic, popular with both the people and the army, Marcellus represented everything Augustus wanted in a successor. He was blood family, he had the Julian name, and he had the kind of natural leadership ability that suggested he could hold the empire together after Augustus was gone. But Marcellus died suddenly in 23 BCE, struck down by what the official records called a fever. He was barely 20 years old, in perfect health, surrounded by the best physicians in the empire. The timing was suspicious, coming just as he was beginning to emerge as a serious political figure in his own right. And the beneficiary of his death, Livia's elder son, Tiberius, who suddenly found himself much closer to the center of imperial succession planning. Ancient historians were divided on what actually happened to Marcellus. Some accepted the official explanation of natural causes. Others whispered about poison, about mysterious illnesses that struck down healthy young men who stood in the way of Claudian ambition. But what's undeniable is that Livia's reaction to Martellus's death was not grief, but opportunity. Within months, she was actively promoting Tiberius as a potential heir, highlighting his military experience and his political acumen. Augustus, devastated by the loss of his chosen successor, eventually adopted his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Julia's sons from her second marriage to Marcus Agrippa. These boys represented the direct Julian bloodline, the genetic continuation of Caesar's legacy. They were young, but they had time to grow into their roles. And Augustus clearly intended them to be his ultimate successors. But Livia was playing a different game entirely. While Augustus focused on blood relationships and legal adoption, she was building a network of loyalty that extended throughout the imperial administration. She cultivated relationships with key senators, with provincial governors, with military commanders who would be crucial in any succession crisis. She made herself indispensable not just to Augustus, but to the entire imperial system. More critically, she began positioning her sons not as rivals to the Julian heirs, but their mentors and protectors. Tiberius became a military commander of extraordinary skill, winning victories in Germany and Pannonia that enhanced his reputation throughout the empire. Dumpsus, her younger son, became equally renowned for his campaigns across the Rhine. Both men were seen as loyal servants of Augustus, devoted stepsons who would naturally support the Julian succession. But then, something interesting happened. Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the golden boys of the Julian line, began experiencing a series of unfortunate accidents. Gaius died in Armenia in 4 CE, officially from wounds received in battle, but under circumstances that raised eyebrows among those who knew imperial politics. Lucius died 2 years earlier in Massilia, again officially from natural causes, but again under circumstances that seemed remarkably convenient for Claudian ambition. By this point, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every potential Julian heir was meeting an untimely end, and every death moved Livia's sons closer to ultimate power. The whispers that had started with Marcellus's death became open speculation among Rome's political class. Was this just an incredible run of bad luck for the Julian family, or was someone systematically eliminating the competition? What made these suspicions even more compelling was Livia's behavior during each crisis. While Augustus mourned his losses, she provided comfort, support, and practical advice about moving forward. She never seemed surprised by these deaths, never appeared caught off guard by the need to find new succession plans. Instead, she consistently presented herself as the voice of reason, the steady hand that could guide Augustus through his grief and help him make the difficult decisions necessary for the empire's future. And her suggestions were always the same. Tiberius was ready,
experienced, loyal, and devoted to Augustus's vision. He had proven himself in battle, in administration, in the complex art of imperial politics. He wasn't seeking power for himself, she would argue. He was simply the most qualified candidate available in increasingly desperate circumstances. The final piece of the puzzle came with the fate of Agrippa, Augustus's last surviving grandson.
Born after his father, Marcus Agrippa's death, Postumus was the final direct male heir of the Julian bloodline, but he was also young, inexperienced, and, according to most sources, difficult to control. Augustus had adopted him along with Tiberius in 4 CE, keeping his options open for the succession. But Postumus proved to be a problem. He was reportedly violent, unpredictable, and completely unsuited for the careful political balancing act that imperial rule required. Augustus eventually banished him to a small island, effectively removing him from succession planning. But exile wasn't enough to satisfy everyone's concerns about the Julian bloodline. In 14 CE, just days after Augustus's death, Postumus was killed by his guards on the remote island where he had been imprisoned. The official story was that he had tried to escape and was killed in the attempt. But the timing was impossibly convenient. With Augustus dead and Tiberius ascending to power, the last potential rival to Claudian rule was eliminated before he could become a rallying point for opposition. And who was in the best position to order Postumus's death? Who had the connections, the authority, and the motive to ensure that the succession passed smoothly to her son? Livia had spent decades building relationships with exactly the kind of people who could arrange for a prisoner's death on a remote island to look like an escape attempt gone wrong. By 14 CE, when Augustus finally died, Livia had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history. Through a combination of political skill, strategic marriages, careful alliance building, and quite possibly systematic assassination, she had maneuvered her son Tiberius into position as the undisputed heir to imperial power. The Claudian dynasty that would rule Rome for the next 50 years wasn't the result of blood inheritance or legal succession. It was the product of one woman's 40-year campaign to seize control of the Roman world. But Livia's triumph came with a cost that she may not have fully anticipated. Tiberius, when he finally became emperor, was not the grateful son she had expected. Instead, he was a bitter, paranoid ruler who resented his mother's influence and actively worked to limit her power. The woman who had spent decades building a network of loyalty and influence found herself increasingly marginalized by the very son she had worked so hard to elevate. This tension between Livia and Tiberius reveals something crucial about the nature of power in imperial Rome. It wasn't enough to win the throne, you had to hold it. And holding it meant eliminating anyone who might challenge your authority, even your own mother. The skills that had made Livia so effective as a power broker behind the scenes became liabilities when she tried to exercise direct influence over imperial policy. But this is where Livia's story reveals its most chilling dimension. Because her conflict with Tiberius wasn't just a family squabble. It was a battle for the soul of the empire itself. And the methods she used to fight it would cement her reputation as one of history's most ruthless political operators. Tiberius had inherited more than just the imperial throne from Augustus. He had also inherited his stepfather's deep suspicion of anyone who might challenge imperial authority. And nobody posed a greater potential challenge than the woman who had orchestrated his rise to power in the first place. Livia knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively.
She had the loyalty of senators, governors, and military commanders who remembered her decades of careful cultivation. Most dangerously, she had her own vision for how the empire should be run, and it didn't always align with her son's increasingly paranoid worldview. The first major clash came over the question of honors. The Roman Senate, eager to curry favor with the new emperor, voted to bestow unprecedented honors on Livia. They wanted to name her Mother of the Fatherland, give her her own bodyguard of lictors, and allow her to sit with the senators during public ceremonies. These weren't just ceremonial gestures. They were formal recognition of Livia's political power, acknowledgments that she was more than just the emperor's mother. Tiberius blocked every single honor. He stood before the Senate and delivered a speech that was a masterclass in political theater, claiming that his beloved mother was too modest to accept such recognition, that she preferred the traditional role of a Roman matron. But everyone in that chamber understood the real message. The new emperor was drawing lines of authority, and his mother was on the wrong side of them. Livia's response was swift and surgical. She began holding her own informal court at her house on the Palatine Hill, receiving foreign ambassadors, meeting with senators, conducting the kind of business that had always been her specialty. She wasn't openly defying Tiberius. She was simply continuing to operate as she always had, as if his restrictions didn't apply to her. This created an impossible situation for anyone trying to navigate imperial politics.
Do you follow the official channels through the emperor's court? Or do you go through the shadow network that Livia had spent 40 years building? Many chose both, hedging their bets in a way that only increased Tiberius's paranoia about his mother's influence. The situation escalated when Livia began intervening in legal cases. Roman law allowed her, as a woman of her status, to petition for clemency on behalf of defendants. But Livia wasn't just asking for mercy. She was actively investigating cases, gathering evidence, and presenting legal arguments that sometimes contradicted the emperor's own judicial preferences. She saved senators from treason charges, protected governors from prosecution for corruption, and consistently positioned herself as an alternative source of justice within the imperial system. For Tiberius, this was intolerable. He had spent his entire career watching his mother manipulate the system from behind the scenes. And now that he held ultimate authority, he discovered that she had no intention of stepping back. Every case she influenced, every person she protected, every decision she overruled was a reminder that his power had been gifted to him by someone who still expected to share in its exercise. The breaking point came in 20 CE with the case of Cnaeus Calpurnius Piso, a senator accused of murdering Germanicus, Tiberius's own adopted son and heir. Germanicus had been the golden boy of the imperial family, beloved by the people and the army, destined to succeed Tiberius as emperor. His sudden death in Syria under mysterious circumstances had triggered a massive investigation and show trial. Piso was clearly guilty, and his convictions seemed certain. But then Livia intervened. Not to save Piso, that would have been impossible given the public outrage over Germanicus's death. Instead, she worked behind the scenes to ensure that the investigation didn't dig too deeply into who might have ordered the murder in the first place.
because if the prosecutors looked too carefully, they might discover that Germanicus's death followed the same pattern as all those other convenient deaths that had cleared the path for Claudian's succession. Piso committed suicide before the trial could conclude, taking his secrets to the grave. But the message was clear to anyone paying attention. Livia was still operating her network, still protecting her interests, still capable of influencing events even when they directly contradicted her son's wishes. The woman who had eliminated Augustus' heirs was now protecting herself from investigation into those eliminations. Tiberius's response was to do something that would have been unthinkable under Augustus. He began systematically dismantling his mother's power base. Senators who had been loyal to Livia found themselves facing treason charges. Governors who had corresponded with her were recalled and replaced. Military commanders who had accepted her patronage discovered that their careers had suddenly stalled. But Livia had been playing this game for too long to be easily outmaneuvered. Every move Tiberius made, she countered with moves of her own. When he restricted her access to foreign delegations, she began meeting with their wives and building influence through the women's networks that existed parallel to official diplomacy. When he limited her correspondence with provincial governors, she started working through their subordinates and creating alternative channels of communication. The conflict reached its most dangerous phase when Livia began positioning Germanicus's children as alternatives to Tiberius himself. Germanicus had left behind several sons, young men with impeccable Julian bloodlines and growing popularity among both the people and the army. If Tiberius died or was removed from power, these boys could provide legitimate alternatives to continued Claudian rule. This was the one thing Tiberius could not tolerate. He had spent decades watching his mother eliminate Julian heirs to secure his own succession. Now she was apparently preparing to eliminate him in favor of the next generation. The paranoia that had always been part of his character exploded into something approaching madness. In 26 CE, Tiberius made the decision that would define the rest of his reign. He left Rome entirely, retiring to the island of Capri and governing the empire through written correspondence. Officially, this was a retreat from the pressures of imperial administration. Unofficially, it was an escape from his mother's influence. On Capri, surrounded by a small circle of loyal advisors, Tiberius could exercise power without worrying about Livia's shadow network undermining his authority.
But even physical distance couldn't fully contain Livia's influence. She remained in Rome, holding court, receiving visitors, and maintaining the relationships that had always been the foundation of her power. Foreign kings still sought her favor. Senators still consulted her on important matters. The city's wealthy women still looked to her for social leadership. In many ways, she had become more powerful in Tiberius's absence than she had been when he was present to check her authority. This created a bizarre situation where the Roman Empire effectively had two centers of power: the emperor on his island retreat and his mother in the capital city. Ambitious politicians learned to navigate both courts, sending one set of messages to Capri and another to the Palatine Hill. The system worked after a fashion, but it was inherently unstable and dependent on the continued restraint of two people who had every reason to destroy each other. The final act in their conflict began in 29 CE, when Livia, now in her 80s, started showing signs of serious illness. For most people, this would have been a time for reconciliation, a chance to heal old wounds before it was too late. But Livia and Tiberius were not most people. They were two of the most ruthless political operators in Roman history, and neither was prepared to show weakness, even in the face of death. Tiberius refused to return to Rome to see his dying mother. He claimed that imperial business kept him on Capri, but everyone understood the real reason. He was afraid that visiting her deathbed would be seen as a sign of reconciliation, a suggestion that he accepted her continuing influence over imperial affairs. Even more dangerous, he worried that she might use their final meeting to extract promises about the succession, binding him to support candidates she favored over his own choices. Livia's response was characteristically brilliant and utterly ruthless. She began meeting with anyone who would listen, telling them exactly what she thought about her son's character, his fitness for rule, and his treatment of his own family. These weren't private complaints shared with close confidants. These were calculated political statements designed to damage Tiberius's reputation and legitimacy. She told senators that Tiberius had always been jealous of more capable leaders, starting with his stepfather, Augustus. She suggested that his retreat to Capri wasn't strategic, but cowardly, the act of a man who couldn't handle the pressures of leadership. Most damaging, she began hinting that she knew things about how various members of the imperial family had died, and that she was considering sharing that information with people who might find it interesting. These weren't idle threats. Livia had spent 40 years accumulating secrets, and she had the documentation to prove her claims. Letters, financial records, correspondence with the kind of people who arranged convenient accidents for inconvenient heirs. If she decided to reveal what she knew about the systematic elimination of the Julian bloodline, it could destroy not just Tiberius's reputation, but the entire legitimacy of Claudian rule. Tiberius found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't return to Rome without appearing to submit to his mother's authority, but he couldn't ignore her threats without risking the exposure of secrets that could topple his regime. The solution he chose reveals everything we need to know about both his character and the nature of imperial power. In August of 29 CE, Livia Drusilla died in her sleep at the age of 86. The official cause was natural causes, the inevitable result of advanced age and declining health. But the timing was remarkably convenient for an emperor who had been desperately searching for a way to silence his mother without appearing to murder her. Tiberius's reaction to her death was telling. He didn't return to Rome for her funeral. He didn't deliver a eulogy celebrating her contributions to the empire. He didn't even allow the Senate to vote her the divine honors that were customary for deceased members of the imperial family. Instead, he issued a brief statement expressing appropriate grief, and immediately moved to dismantle every institution she had built. Her correspondence was seized and destroyed. Her household staff was dismissed or transferred to remote provinces. Her financial accounts were audited and her assets redistributed. Within months of her death, it was as if Livia Drusilla had never existed as a political force. The woman who had shaped 40 years of Roman history was erased from the official record with the same methodical precision she had once used to eliminate her enemies. But Tiberius's victory came at a cost that he may not have fully understood. In destroying his mother's network, he had eliminated one of the most effective intelligence and administration systems the empire had ever seen. Livia's people had not just been loyal to her personally. They had been competent administrators, skilled diplomats, and effective problem solvers. Their removal created a vacuum that was never adequately filled.
More importantly, Tiberius had demonstrated that imperial power was ultimately personal and arbitrary. If the emperor could eliminate his own mother when she became inconvenient, what protection did anyone else have?
The paranoia and fear that would characterize the rest of his reign wasn't just a product of his personality. It was a rational response to the precedent he had established. The irony is that in trying to escape her mother's influence, Tiberius had become exactly the kind of ruler she had always feared he might be. Isolated, suspicious, dependent on a small circle of advisors who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The skills that had made him an effective military commander and competent administrator proved inadequate for the complex political balancing act that successful imperial rule required. By 37 CE, when Tiberius finally died, also under mysterious circumstances that suggested poison, the Claudian dynasty that Livia had worked so hard to establish was already showing signs of the instability that would eventually destroy it. Her great-grandson, Caligula, who succeeded Tiberius, proved to be exactly the kind of unstable ruler that the imperial system was designed to prevent. But perhaps that was always inevitable. The methods Livia had used to secure power for her family, the systematic elimination of alternatives, the cultivation of fear and paranoia as tools of control, these approaches created a political culture where violence was always just beneath the surface. The empire she had helped create was built on foundations of murder and manipulation that made long-term stability impossible. Yet for all her ruthlessness, for all the blood on her hands, Livia Drusilla had achieved something genuinely remarkable. She had taken a political system designed to exclude women from power and bent it to her will through sheer force of intelligence and determination. She had outlived and outmaneuvered some of the most capable political operators in Roman history. She had created a dynasty that would rule the known world for half a century. The question that haunted her contemporaries, and should haunt us, is whether that achievement was worth the price in human lives it required. Because make no mistake, Livia's success was built on a foundation of corpses, the bodies of everyone who had stood between her and ultimate power. The young men who had died of convenient illnesses, the political rivals who had suffered fatal accidents, the inconvenient witnesses who had committed suicide at exactly the right moment. And here's what makes Livia's story even more chilling. She didn't just eliminate her enemies, she turned their deaths into opportunities to demonstrate her own virtue and loyalty to Augustus. Every funeral became a stage for her to display the perfect grief of a devoted Roman matron. Every tragedy became a chance to show how she could guide the imperial family through crisis with wisdom and strength. Take the death of Marcellus, Augustus's golden boy nephew. While Augustus mourned the loss of his chosen heir, Livia was already positioning herself as the voice of practical wisdom. She didn't openly celebrate the young man's death. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she became the perfect counselor, gently suggesting that perhaps the gods had other plans for the succession. Perhaps they were guiding Augustus toward a different choice, someone more experienced, more tested by adversity. And who better than her own son, Tiberius? He had proven himself in the German campaigns, had shown the kind of steady leadership that the empire needed. He wasn't seeking power for himself, she would argue with perfect maternal modesty. He was simply available to serve if Augustus needed him. This is where Livia's genius becomes truly terrifying. She understood that the most effective manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation at all. It feels like wisdom, like practical advice from someone who only wants what's best for everyone involved.
She never pushed too hard, never seemed overly eager to advance her own interests. Instead, she created situations where her preferred outcomes seemed like the only logical choices. The pattern repeated itself with each convenient death. When Gallius Caesar died in Armenia, Livia was there to comfort Augustus in his grief and help him think through the implications for imperial succession. When Lucius Caesar died in Massilia, she was ready with thoughtful analysis of who might be qualified to step into his role. Each tragedy somehow made Tiberius look more indispensable.
More obviously, the right choice for the future of Rome. But what really sets Livia apart from other ambitious Romans is how she managed to make her enemies complicit in their own destruction. She didn't just poison people and hope no one would notice. She created circumstances where their deaths served multiple political purposes, where even their allies had to admit that their passing might be for the best. Consider how she handled Agrippa, Augustus's last surviving grandson. By all accounts, Postumus was violent, unpredictable, and completely unsuited for imperial responsibility. His own grandfather had banished him, effectively admitting that the boy was too dangerous to remain in Rome. When Postumus died, even people who suspected foul play had to acknowledge that his death solved a genuine problem for imperial stability. This is the mark of a true political mastermind. Livia didn't just eliminate inconvenient people. She eliminated them in ways that made their deaths seem like solutions rather than murders. She turned assassination into statecraft, making herself appear as the steady hand protecting Rome from chaos, rather than the architect of that chaos. The most chilling example of this came with her treatment of Julia, Augustus's only child and the mother of his potential heirs. Julia was a problem for Livia on multiple levels. She was popular, intelligent, and politically connected in her own right. More importantly, she was the mother of the Julian heirs who stood between Tiberius and ultimate power. As long as Julia remained influential in imperial politics, she could rally support for her sons and against Claudian ambitions. Livia's solution was masterful in its subtlety. She didn't have Julia killed. That would have been too obvious and too dangerous given her popularity. Instead, she orchestrated Julia's destruction through scandal. Roman society was obsessed with female virtue, particularly the virtue of women in the imperial family. A woman's reputation was fragile and once damaged, nearly impossible to repair. Julia was undoubtedly having affairs. This was common knowledge among the Roman elite. But affairs were typically overlooked as long as they remained discreet and didn't threaten political stability. What changed was how information about Julia's relationships began reaching Augustus. Suddenly, detailed reports of her activities were appearing on his desk, complete with dates, locations, and witness testimony. The sources of these reports were never clearly identified, but they all seemed to come through channels that Livia controlled. Servants who owed their positions to her patronage, social contacts who sought her favor, military officers who had served under Tiberius and remained loyal to the Claudian family, a network of informants that could monitor Julia's every move and report back with the kind of detailed intelligence that no private individual should have been able to gather. Augustus was devastated when he finally confronted the evidence of his daughter's behavior. This wasn't just about personal betrayal, it was about political survival. The imperial family's reputation for virtue was crucial to their legitimacy. If Julia's scandals became public, they could undermine the entire Augustan settlement and provide ammunition for political enemies. His response was swift and brutal.
Julia was exiled to a tiny island, cut off from all political contact, forbidden from receiving visitors except under strict supervision. Her mother, Scribonia, chose to accompany her into exile, a gesture of loyalty that effectively removed another potential source of opposition to Claudian interests. In one perfectly orchestrated scandal, Livia had eliminated both Augustus's daughter and his first wife from imperial politics. But the real genius of this operation was how it positioned Livia herself. While Julia was being destroyed for her supposed moral failings, Livia appeared as the perfect contrast. She was faithful, discreet, supportive of her husband's decisions even when they caused him pain. She became the acceptable face of imperial womanhood, the standard by which all other women in the imperial family would be measured. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Cross Livia, and you might find your private life becoming uncomfortably public. Support her interests and enjoy the protection of someone who clearly knew how to destroy enemies while keeping her own hands clean. This wasn't just political maneuvering, it was psychological warfare conducted with surgical precision. And the most terrifying aspect of all this is how Livia managed to maintain her reputation for virtue throughout decades of systematic elimination. She attended every funeral, mourned every death, supported every grieving family member with exactly the right combination of sympathy and strength. She became known as the perfect Roman matron, devoted to her family, loyal to her husband, wise in her counsel. The people who suspected her true nature were either too afraid to speak or too implicated in her activities to risk exposure. The senators who had benefited from her patronage couldn't criticize her methods without admitting their own complicity. The military commanders who owed their positions to her influence had every reason to support the official versions of convenient deaths. She had created a conspiracy of silence that protected her from accountability, while she systematically reshaped the empire to serve her family's interests. This is what made Livia so dangerous and what makes her story so relevant today. She understood that the most effective form of power is the kind that doesn't look like power at all. She wielded influence through relationships, through information, through the careful management of other people's perceptions and interests. She made herself indispensable while making her enemies expendable.
By the time Augustus died in 14 CE, Livia had achieved something that should have been impossible for a Roman woman. She had become the de facto co-ruler of the empire, the person whose approval was necessary for major political decisions, whose opposition could destroy careers and end lives. She had done this not by challenging the system directly, but by working within it so skillfully that she had bent it to her will. The transition to Tiberius's reign should have been her moment of ultimate triumph. After 40 years of careful planning and ruthless execution, her son was emperor and she was the power behind the throne. But this is where Livia's story takes its most ironic turn. Because the very skills that had made her so successful in gaining power made her a threat to the son she had worked so hard to elevate. Tiberius understood exactly how his mother operated because he had watched her do it for decades. He knew about the networks of informants, the carefully cultivated relationships, the ability to make inconvenient people disappear. More importantly, he knew that she viewed him not as the ultimate goal of her ambitions, but as another step in a longer plan that might eventually require his own elimination if he proved insufficiently grateful or controllable. The conflict between them wasn't just personal, it was existential. Two master manipulators who knew each other's methods too well to trust each other, locked in a struggle where only one could survive with their power intact. And watching this battle unfold reveals something crucial about the nature of tyranny itself. Because what Livia had created wasn't just a path to power for her family. It was a template for how power could be exercised in the imperial system. The methods she pioneered, the networks she built, the culture of fear and favor she established, these became permanent features of Roman politics. Future emperors would use her playbook, adapting her techniques to their own circumstances and ambitions. The systematic elimination of rivals, the use of scandal and reputation destruction as political weapons, the cultivation of informant networks that could monitor and control the behavior of potential threats. All of these became standard operating procedures for imperial rule. What had started as one woman's quest for family advancement became the foundation for centuries of autocratic government. And perhaps this was always inevitable. The Roman Republic had died not because of military conquest or natural disaster, but because the system of shared power and collective decision-making had proven inadequate for governing a world empire. What replaced it had to be personal, centralized, and ruthless enough to maintain control over dozens of provinces, hundreds of client kingdoms, and millions of people with competing interests and loyalties. Livia didn't create the need for imperial autocracy, but she perfected the methods by which that autocracy could be exercised effectively. She showed how a single person could maintain control over a vast and complex political system through the careful application of intelligence, influence, and violence. Her techniques worked so well that they became institutionalized, passed down from ruler to ruler like a manual for successful tyranny. But there was a price for this success, and it wasn't just paid by her victims. The political culture that Livia helped create was inherently unstable because it depended entirely on the personal qualities and relationships of whoever happened to hold power. When those relationships broke down, as they inevitably did between Livia and Tiberius, the entire system became vulnerable to chaos and collapse. The paranoia that characterized Tiberius's later reign wasn't just a personal failing. It was a rational response to the methods his mother had used to gain power. If she could eliminate Augustus's heirs through poison and manipulation, what was to stop someone from using the same methods against the Claudian dynasty? If she could orchestrate scandals to destroy political enemies, what prevented her from manufacturing scandals against her own son if he disappointed her? This is the ultimate tragedy of Livia's story. In fighting so hard to secure power for her family, she had created a system where that power could never be secure. Every emperor who followed would face the same threats she had posed to Augustus's original heirs. Every succession would be marked by the same kind of suspicious deaths and convenient accidents that had cleared Tiberius's path to the throne. The empire she had helped shape would be plagued for centuries by the very problems her methods had been designed to solve. Political instability, succession crisis, the constant threat of assassination, the breakdown of trust between rulers and ruled. All of these became permanent features of imperial government because the techniques that worked so well for Livia in the short term created unsolvable long-term problems. And yet, for all the destruction she caused, for all the lives lost to her ambitions, Livia Drusilla remains one of the most remarkable figures in ancient history. She took a system designed to exclude women from political power and dominated it more completely than most men ever managed to do.
She outlasted and outmaneuvered politicians, generals, and emperors who had every advantage of birth, wealth, and social position. Her success wasn't based on luck or circumstances beyond her control. It was the product of intelligence, patience, and an absolutely ruthless commitment to achieving her goals, regardless of the human cost. She understood power in ways that most people never will, seeing it not as a prize to be won, but as a tool to be wielded with precision and discipline. The question her story raises is whether that kind of success is worth celebrating or condemning. Because Livia achieved everything she set out to accomplish, but she did it by becoming something monstrous in the process. She secured her family's future by destroying other families. She created stability by eliminating anyone who might threaten that stability. She built a dynasty on a foundation of systematic murder and manipulation. Perhaps that's the most important lesson her story teaches us about power itself.
The methods that are most effective for gaining and holding power are often the methods that do the most damage to the societies where that power is exercised. The skills that make someone successful in political competition are frequently the same skills that make them dangerous as actual rulers. Livia Drusilla was undoubtedly one of the most capable political operators in human history. She was also one of the most destructive. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about leadership and ambition. Sometimes the people who are best at getting power are exactly the people who should never be allowed to have it. But understanding her methods, recognizing the patterns she established, seeing how she turned institutional weaknesses into personal advantages, these insights remain relevant because the fundamental dynamics of power haven't changed as much as we might like to think. The specific techniques may be different, the technology more advanced, the scale larger, but the basic human drives that motivated Livia still motivate political actors today. Her legacy isn't just the Claudian dynasty or the imperial system she helped create. It's the demonstration that with enough intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness, it's possible to reshape entire civilizations to serve personal ambitions. That's a lesson that's both inspiring and terrifying, depending on whether you're the one wielding the power or living under it. And as Tiberius discovered when he finally tried to break free from his mother's influence, some victories come at such a high price that they destroy the very thing you were fighting to protect. The empire that Livia had secured for her family became a prison for the son she had elevated to rule it. A system so dependent on fear and manipulation that it couldn't function any other way. This is where her story becomes not just historical narrative, but genuine tragedy. Because Livia succeeded in everything she attempted, and that success ultimately destroyed everything she claimed to value. She won the game of imperial politics so completely that she made it impossible for anyone, including her own family, to enjoy the victory. The reign of Tiberius that followed Livia's death revealed the full scope of what she had accomplished and destroyed. When the emperor finally returned to Rome in 37 CE, after years of self-imposed exile on Capri, he found a capital that barely recognized him. The networks of loyalty and information that had once flowed through his mother's house had withered and died. The senators who had once sought her favor now avoided imperial politics entirely, too frightened of Tiberius's paranoia to risk involvement in government affairs.
But the most telling evidence of Livia's lasting influence came in the form of Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect who had effectively ruled Rome in Tiberius's absence. Here was a man who had studied Livia's methods with the devotion of a scholar examining ancient texts. He understood that real power came not from holding official titles, but from controlling information and access to the person who did hold those titles. Sejanus had built his own network of informants throughout the city, placing his supporters in key positions within the imperial administration. He monitored the correspondence of potential rivals, cultivated relationships with foreign diplomats, and gradually made himself indispensable to an emperor who preferred governing from a distance. Most importantly, he began eliminating threats to his own position using exactly the same methods Livia had perfected decades earlier. The deaths started small, with minor officials who had asked inconvenient questions about finances or military deployments. Then they escalated to include senators who had shown insufficient loyalty to Sejanus personally rather than to the emperor he claimed to serve. Each death was explained by plausible circumstances: heart failures, riding accidents, sudden illnesses that struck down otherwise healthy men in the prime of their careers. The pattern was so familiar that older senators, the ones who remembered Livia's rise to power, began making nervous jokes about history repeating itself. But their laughter carried an edge of fear, because they recognized what was happening. The techniques that had once served imperial interests were now being used to advance the ambitions of someone with no legitimate claim to power beyond his ability to manipulate the system. Tiberius, isolated on his island retreat, initially welcomed Sejanus's efficiency in handling day-to-day administration. Here was someone who could manage the tedious details of governing while allowing the emperor to focus on broader strategic concerns. But gradually, disturbing reports began reaching Capri. Foreign ambassadors were bypassing imperial channels and dealing directly with the Praetorian prefect. Military commanders were receiving orders that the emperor hadn't authorized. Most alarmingly, senators were beginning to show Sejanus the kind of deference that should have been reserved for the emperor himself. The crisis came to a head in 31 CE, when Tiberius finally realized that Sejanus wasn't just managing imperial business. He was preparing to replace the emperor entirely. The Praetorian prefect had arranged marriages that would connect him to the imperial family, eliminated potential rivals who might oppose his elevation, and cultivated the support of key military units stationed near Rome.
He was following Livia's playbook so precisely that Tiberius could predict exactly what would happen next. The emperor's response revealed how much he had learned from watching his mother operate for 4 decades. Rather than confronting Silvanus directly, which would have given the Praetorian prefect time to activate his own networks and potentially trigger a civil war, Tiberius used misdirection and political theater to isolate his enemy before destroying him. He sent a letter to the Senate that appeared to be granting Sejanus additional honors and responsibilities. The senators, eager to curry favor with someone they believed was ascending to even greater power, gathered in the Temple of Apollo to hear what they expected would be a celebration of the Praetorian prefect's achievements. Instead, they found themselves listening to a document that systematically dismantled Sejanus's reputation and accused him of treason against the imperial family. The speed with which Sejanus's support collapsed revealed something crucial about the nature of power in imperial Rome.
The networks of loyalty that seem so strong were actually incredibly fragile, dependent entirely on the perception that their patron would continue to be useful for advancing other people's interests. The moment that perception changed, former allies became eager to distance themselves from someone who had suddenly become dangerous to know. Sionis was executed the same day, along with his children and most prominent supporters. The systematic elimination of his network took months, with investigations revealing the full scope of the conspiracy he had built within the imperial administration. But what made these revelations particularly disturbing was how closely they mirrored the methods that Livia had used to advance her own family's interests. The same techniques that had seemed like statesmanship when employed by the emperor's mother looked like treason when used by an ambitious subordinate. The difference wasn't in the methods themselves, but in whether they served or threatened the interests of whoever happened to hold ultimate power. This realization forced Romans to confront an uncomfortable truth about their political system. It was vulnerable to manipulation by anyone clever enough to understand how influence really worked. The Sionis affair also revealed the long-term consequences of Livia's success in centralizing power around personal relationships rather than institutional structures. Because the empire depended so heavily on networks of loyalty and favor rather than formal legal procedures, it was inherently vulnerable to exactly the kind of infiltration and subversion that the Praetorian prefect had attempted. More disturbing still was the realization that Sionis hadn't invented his methods. He had simply applied techniques that were already embedded in the imperial system. The informant networks, the strategic elimination of rivals, the careful cultivation of key supporters, all of these had become standard operating procedures for anyone seeking advancement in imperial politics. What Livia had pioneered as tools for advancing her family's interests had evolved into the fundamental mechanics of how power was exercised throughout the empire. This institutionalization of manipulation had profound effects on Roman society that extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. The constant surveillance and suspicion that characterized imperial administration created a culture where trust became a luxury that few could afford. Senators learned to watch their words in public and their associations in private. Military commanders understood that loyalty to their troops might be seen as potential disloyalty to the emperor. Provincial governors discovered that success in their assignments could be as dangerous as failure if it made them appear too competent or independent. The psychological toll of living under such conditions was enormous. Ancient sources from this period describe a society where paranoia had become a survival skill and where genuine friendship was virtually impossible among the political classes. People learned to maintain multiple sets of relationships, presenting different faces to different audiences depending on what seemed most advantageous at any given moment. But perhaps the most tragic consequence of this system was what it did to the imperial family itself. The techniques that Livia had used to secure power for her descendants created a template that those descendants would inevitably use against each other. The Claudian dynasty that she had worked so hard to establish became a snake pit where family members viewed each other as potential threats rather than natural allies. Caligula, who succeeded Tiberius in 37 CE, had grown up watching his relatives destroy each other through poison, scandal, and political manipulation. His own father, Germanicus, had died under suspicious circumstances that pointed toward imperial involvement. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, had been exiled and effectively murdered by Tiberius. His brothers had been eliminated through various convenient accidents and sudden illnesses. By the time Caligula became emperor, he had learned that family loyalty was a weakness that could be exploited by enemies, and that the only way to maintain power was to eliminate potential rivals before they could eliminate you.
His reign, marked by increasing paranoia and violence, was the logical outcome of the political culture that Livia had helped create. The young emperor's behavior, which historians have traditionally attributed to madness or inherent cruelty, makes much more sense when viewed as a rational response to the realities of imperial politics. Caligula had watched 3 generations of his family destroy each other, using methods that were now embedded in the system of government itself. His apparent insanity was actually a hyper-rational application of techniques that had proven successful for his predecessors. When Caligula declared himself a living god, demanded that senators worship him as a deity, and began eliminating rivals based on dreams and omens rather than actual evidence of treason, he was simply taking the logic of imperial autocracy to its ultimate conclusion. If the emperor's will was the only law that mattered, if loyalty to the imperial person was the only virtue that counted, if potential threats had to be eliminated before they could materialize, then why not acknowledge the essentially religious nature of imperial power? His assassination in 41 CE by his own Praetorian Guard demonstrated that even the most extreme applications of Livy's methods had natural limits. But the fact that he was replaced by his uncle Claudius, another member of the dynasty she had established, showed that her fundamental achievement remained intact. The Claudian family continued to hold power not because of any inherent legitimacy, but because the alternatives seemed even more dangerous to the people who would have to live under them. Claudius himself represented everything that Livia's system was designed to prevent. He was physically disabled, considered intellectually inferior by most of his contemporaries, and had spent decades being dismissed as irrelevant to serious political affairs. Under the old Republican system, he would never have been considered for high office. But in the imperial system that his grandmother had helped create, his very weakness made him an acceptable choice for people who were terrified of another strong emperor who might turn Caligula's methods against them. The irony was profound. The woman who had eliminated Augustus's heirs because they might have proven too independent or capable had created a system where incompetence became a qualification for leadership. The empire that had once been governed by some of the most capable administrators and military commanders in human history was now being ruled by someone whose primary qualification was that he seemed unlikely to be effective enough to pose a serious threat to anyone. But Claudius surprised everyone, including probably himself, by proving to be a remarkably capable emperor. His supposed intellectual limitations turned out to be careful political camouflage that had allowed him to survive decades of imperial family purges by appearing too harmless to eliminate. His physical disabilities, rather than making him weak, had forced him to develop exactly the kind of careful analytical skills that effective governance required. More importantly, Claudius understood the system he had inherited better than any of his predecessors because he had observed it from the outside for so long. He had watched Livia build her medworks, seen Tiberius struggle with the paranoia that imperial power generated, witnessed Caligula's attempt to resolve the contradictions of autocracy through divine monarchy. He knew what worked and what didn't because he had been studying the problem his entire life. His solution was characteristically subtle and effective. Rather than trying to dismantle the networks of influence and information that had become central to imperial government, he institutionalized them.
He created formal positions for the people who had previously operated in the shadows, giving them official titles and defined responsibilities. The freedmen who had served as informal advisors to previous emperors became secretaries of state with specific portfolios. The informant networks that had operated through personal relationships became intelligence services with bureaucratic structures. This transformation didn't eliminate the fundamental problems of imperial autocracy, but it made them more predictable and manageable. Instead of depending entirely on the personal qualities of whoever happened to be emperor, the system now had institutional mechanisms that could function regardless of whether the ruler was competent or not. It was a brilliant adaptation of Livy's techniques that preserved their effectiveness while reducing their inherent instability. But the most significant aspect of Claudius's reign was how it revealed the true scope of what Livia had accomplished. The governmental structures he created, the administrative procedures he established, the legal precedents he set, all of these built on foundations that she had laid decades earlier. Her influence on imperial politics wasn't just personal or dynastic, it was systemic and institutional in ways that would persist long after her specific family line had disappeared. The provincial administration that allowed Rome to govern territories from Britain to Mesopotamia used information networks based on models she had pioneered.
The legal system that regulated relationships between citizens and subjects incorporated precedents established during her conflicts with various imperial rivals. The military command structure that maintained peace across 3 continents relied on loyalty relationships that followed patterns she had perfected. Even more remarkably, the cultural expectations that defined how imperial power should be exercised bore her fingerprints. The idea that emperors should be accessible to petitioners, that they should maintain correspondence with provincial governors, that they should intervene personally in legal cases that affected imperial interests. All of these practices traced back to techniques she had developed for maintaining influence during Augustus's reign. This institutionalization of her methods meant that Livia's influence on Roman history extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of her actions. She had fundamentally changed how power worked in the ancient world, creating new models for how individuals could exercise authority over complex societies and diverse populations. The techniques she pioneered would be copied and adapted by rulers throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. But perhaps the most lasting aspect of her legacy was psychological rather than institutional. Livia had demonstrated that it was possible for someone who started with relatively few advantages to reshape entire civilizations through the systematic application of intelligence and ruthlessness. She had shown that the formal structures of government mattered less than the informal networks of relationship and influence that actually determined how decisions were made. This lesson wasn't lost on subsequent generations of ambitious individuals who found themselves operating within systems that seemed designed to exclude them from meaningful power. Women in particular began studying her methods, adapting her techniques to their own circumstances and opportunities. The imperial wives who followed her, from Messalina to Agrippina the Younger to Julia Domina, all drew inspiration from her example and applied variations of her strategies to their own quests for influence. But her influence extended beyond gender lines. Provincial elites who wanted to advance their family's interests in the imperial system used her playbook to build relationships with key administrators and military commanders. Freedmen who sought to translate their proximity to power into lasting advantage studied her methods for cultivating loyalty and eliminating rivals.
Even foreign rulers who needed to navigate Roman politics learned from her example of how personal relationships could be more important than formal treaties. The result was a gradual transformation of political culture throughout the Roman world. The careful, patient manipulation of relationships and information that had once been Livia's signature approach became standard operating procedure for anyone seeking advancement in imperial society. What had started as one woman's unique response to the challenges of her particular situation evolved into a general template for how power could be acquired and exercised effectively. This democratization of her techniques, if that's the right word, for the spread of manipulation and assassination as political tools had profound consequences for the stability and character of Roman civilization. The empire that emerged from this process was remarkably successful at maintaining control over vast territories and diverse populations. But it was also characterized by levels of surveillance, suspicion, and violence that would have been unthinkable under the old republican system. The trade-off was probably inevitable given the scale and complexity of governing a world empire, but it represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between rulers and ruled. The Roman Republic, for all its flaws and limitations, had been based on the idea that political power should be shared among citizens who were capable of making rational decisions about their collective interests. The imperial system that replaced it was based on the idea that such shared decision-making was impossible at scale, and that effective governance required centralized control exercised by people who were willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain stability. Livia had proven that this approach could work, but she had also demonstrated the human costs that effectiveness required.
The empire she helped create was more powerful and more durable than the republic it replaced, but it was also more brutal and more dehumanizing for the people who lived under it. Her legacy was a system that could conquer the known world, but struggled to maintain the trust and loyalty of its own citizens. The final irony of her story is that the dynasty she worked so hard to establish ultimately fell victim to the very methods she had used to create it. Nero, the last Claudian emperor, was destroyed by the same combination of paranoia and violence that had elevated his family to power in the first place. His suicide in 68 CE marked the end of the line that had begun with her marriage to Augustus 7 decades earlier. But by then, it didn't matter whether the Claudian dynasty survived or not, because the imperial system had become larger than any individual family or ruler. The techniques Livia had pioneered had been institutionalized so thoroughly that they continued to function regardless of who happened to be wearing the purple. The empire she had helped shape would endure for another 4 centuries in the West and more than 1,000 years in the East, but it would always bear the marks of the methods she had used to create it. Understanding her story helps us see how individual actions can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. Livia made specific choices in response to particular challenges she faced as a Roman woman in the 1st century BCE. But those choices and the techniques she developed to implement them became part of the basic structure of how power was exercised in the ancient world. Her influence on subsequent history wasn't accidental or incidental. It was the direct result of her success in solving problems that other people couldn't solve. She found ways to make the imperial system work effectively, and those ways became permanent features of how that system operated. The fact that her solutions often involved murder and manipulation doesn't change the reality that they were solutions.
techniques that achieved their intended purposes and could be replicated by others facing similar challenges. This is what makes her story both fascinating and disturbing. Livia Drusilla was undoubtedly one of the most capable political operators in human history, someone who overcame enormous obstacles through intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. But she was also someone who left a trail of bodies behind her and created a political culture where violence became a normal tool of governance. The question her legacy poses is whether it's possible to separate effectiveness from morality when evaluating historical figures and their influence. Because by any measure of political success, Livia achieved everything she set out to accomplish and more. She secured power for her family, created lasting institutions, and fundamentally changed how an entire civilization approached the challenges of governance. But she did all of this through methods that we would rightfully condemn as criminal if employed by contemporary political figures. Perhaps that's the most important lesson her story teaches us, about the nature of power itself. The skills and techniques that make someone effective at gaining and holding political authority are often the same skills and techniques that make them dangerous to the societies they govern. The methods that work in political competition frequently cause enormous harm when applied to actual governance. Livia's success came from her willingness to do things that other people wouldn't do, to cross lines that other people respected, to pursue objectives with a single-minded focus that ignored the human costs of her actions. These qualities made her extraordinarily effective as a political operator, but they also made her a source of enormous suffering for the people who got in her way. The empire she helped create was built on this fundamental contradiction between effectiveness and morality, between the techniques that worked for maintaining power and the values that made that power worth having. The Roman system that emerged from her influence was remarkably successful at achieving its basic objectives of maintaining order and prosperity across a vast territory. But it was also characterized by levels of cruelty and oppression that ultimately undermined its own legitimacy. This tension between effectiveness and morality wasn't unique to ancient Rome. Of course, it's a recurring theme in human history, appearing whenever societies face the choice between accepting flawed but functional leadership and risking chaos in pursuit of more ethical alternatives.
Livia's story is particularly relevant because she demonstrated so clearly how individual choices about methods and objectives can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that motivated those choices. Her legacy forces us to confront difficult questions about the relationship between means and ends in political life. Is it acceptable to use morally questionable methods if they achieve important objectives? How do we weigh immediate effectiveness against long-term consequences? What responsibility do successful leaders bear for the techniques that others copy from their example? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical challenges that every generation of political leaders must address. And Livia's story provides one of the clearest historical examples of both the potential and the dangers of choosing effectiveness over ethical constraints when pursuing political objectives. The woman who started as a teenage refugee fleeing civil war ended up reshaping the ancient world through the systematic application of intelligence and ruthlessness. Her methods worked so well that they became permanent features of how power was exercised in her society and beyond. But the political culture she helped create ultimately consumed the very dynasty she had worked so hard to establish. That's perhaps the most fitting end to her story. Livia Drusilla succeeded in everything she attempted.
But her success created a system where no one, not even her own descendants, could ever be truly safe from the methods she had pioneered. She won the game of imperial politics so completely that she made it impossible for anyone to enjoy the victory she had achieved. The irony of Livia's legacy became even more apparent with the rise of Agrippina the Younger, her great-granddaughter and perhaps her most apt pupil. If you thought Livia was ruthless, wait until you see what happened when someone who had grown up studying her methods decided to apply them in the next generation. Agrippina had watched the Claudian dynasty tear itself apart through the very techniques her ancestor had perfected, and she had learned every lesson those failures could teach. Born in 15 CE, Agrippina the Younger was the daughter of Germanicus, that golden boy whose convenient death had cleared another obstacle from the path to imperial power. She had lived through Caligula's reign of terror, survived Claudius's attempts at reform, and emerged as one of the most formidable political operators of her generation. But unlike Livia, who had operated in the shadows and maintained the fiction of traditional Roman womanhood, Agrippina was prepared to exercise power openly and directly. Her first major move was classic Livian strategy, with a modern twist. When her uncle Claudius needed a new wife after executing his previous Empress Messalina for treason, Agrippina positioned herself as the obvious choice. Never mind that she was his niece, that Roman law traditionally prohibited such marriages, that she was already married to someone else. These were merely obstacles to be overcome through the same combination of legal manipulation and political pressure that had worked so well for her great-grandmother. The marriage took place in 49 CE, and immediately Agrippina began demonstrating that she had learned more than just Livia's techniques. She had also absorbed the lesson that those techniques needed to be updated for changing circumstances. Where Livia had worked through informal networks and personal relationships, Agrippina demanded formal recognition of her authority. She had her image placed on coins alongside the emperor's, received foreign ambassadors in her own right, and attended Senate meetings as if she were a co-ruler rather than just an imperial wife. But the most brilliant aspect of Agrippina's strategy was how she used her son to legitimize her own power. The boy was Claudius's stepson through their marriage, but he was also a direct descendant of Augustus through his father's line. This gave him a stronger claim to imperial succession than Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus, who was younger and lacked the same prestigious bloodlines. What followed was a masterclass in applied Livian methodology updated for the realities of mid-century imperial politics. Agrippina began systematically eliminating anyone who might support Britannicus's claim to succession, while simultaneously building a power base for Nero that extended throughout the imperial administration and military command structure. The deaths started with Marcus Junius Silenus, a descendant of Augustus, who might have served as an alternative to both Nero and Britannicus. He committed suicide on the day of Agrippina's wedding to Claudius, a timing so convenient that even contemporary sources didn't bother pretending it was coincidental. Then came Appius Silanus, another potential rival, followed by a series of senators and equestrians who had shown insufficient enthusiasm for Nero's advancement. Each death followed the familiar pattern that Livia had established decades earlier: plausible circumstances, official explanations that couldn't quite be disproved, and timing that served Agrippina's interests perfectly. But what made her campaign even more effective than her predecessors was how she combined elimination with elevation. Every rival who disappeared was replaced by someone who owed their position to her patronage and understood that their continued success depended on Nero's advancement. The climax came in 54 CE, with the death of Claudius himself. The emperor had been showing signs of reconsidering the succession, possibly influenced by advisors who argued that Britannicus, despite his youth, had a stronger legal claim to imperial power than his stepbrother. For Agrippina, this represented exactly the kind of threat that her great-great-grandmother's methods were designed to address.
Claudius died suddenly after eating mushrooms at a family dinner. The official cause was food poisoning, but the circumstances were suspicious enough that contemporary sources openly speculated about murder. The timing was perfect for Agrippina's interests, occurring just as the emperor seemed to be wavering in his support for Nero's succession, and before he could make any formal changes to his arrangements. What happened next demonstrated how thoroughly Agrippina had internalized Livia's lessons about the importance of controlling information and managing perceptions. She delayed announcing Claudius's death for several hours while Nero's supporters secured key positions throughout the city. When the news finally broke, it was accompanied by the immediate proclamation of 17-year-old Nero as the new emperor, presented as the natural and inevitable succession that Claudius had always intended. The speed and efficiency of the transition left potential opponents no time to organize resistance. By the time anyone could question the legitimacy of what had happened, Nero was already emperor, and Agrippina was effectively ruling the empire as his regent. She had achieved something that even Livia had never managed: direct, open exercise of imperial power in her own name. But this triumph contained the seeds of its own destruction. Because Agrippina had made the same fundamental miscalculation that had plagued her great-great-grandmother's later years, she assumed that the son she had elevated to power would remain grateful and controllable indefinitely. Instead, Nero proved to have inherited not just imperial authority, but also the paranoid instincts that came with it. The young emperor had grown up watching his mother eliminate rivals and manipulate the political system to serve her interests. He understood exactly how she operated because he had been her primary beneficiary and closest observer. But he had also learned that in the imperial system she had helped perfect, there was no such thing as permanent safety, no alliance so strong that it couldn't be broken if circumstances changed. As Nero matured and began asserting his own authority, he inevitably came into conflict with a mother who had spent years making herself indispensable to imperial decision-making. Agrippina had networks of informants throughout the administration, relationships with key military commanders, and her own vision for how the empire should be governed. From Nero's perspective, these assets made her not just a valuable advisor, but a potential threat. The conflict escalated when Agrippina began opposing some of Nero's personal choices, particularly his relationship with a freedwoman named Claudia Act. For most Roman mothers, a son's romantic entanglements would have been a private family matter. But Agrippina understood that in imperial politics, personal relationships were always political relationships. And Nero's affair represented a challenge to her authority over his decision-making. Her attempts to control Nero's private life triggered exactly the kind of power struggle that had characterized relations between Livia and Tiberius decades earlier. Two master manipulators who knew each other's methods too well to trust each other, locked in a conflict where compromise was impossible because both understood that the stakes were literally life and death. Nero's solution was characteristically direct and brutal. In 59 CE, 5 years after becoming emperor, he arranged for his mother's assassination. The method he chose revealed both his understanding of her techniques and his determination to surpass them in audacity. Rather than relying on poison or convenient accidents, he attempted to kill her in a specially designed collapsible boat that would make her death look like a tragic maritime accident.
When that elaborate scheme failed, because Agrippina proved to be a stronger swimmer than anticipated, Nero abandoned subtlety entirely and had her beaten to death by his soldiers. The official explanation was that she had been plotting against the emperor's life and had been killed while resisting arrest. But nobody believed the story, because everybody understood what had actually happened. The murder of Agrippina marked a turning point in imperial history, not because matricide was particularly shocking by the standards of Roman politics, but because it demonstrated that the techniques Livy had pioneered had evolved beyond their original purposes. What had started as methods for advancing family interests had become tools for eliminating anyone, including family members, who posed potential challenges to individual power. Nero's reign devolved into exactly the kind of paranoid tyranny that the imperial system seemed designed to produce. He killed his wife, his stepbrother, his advisors, and eventually himself when the army finally revolted against his rule. The Claudian dynasty that Livy had worked so hard to establish died with him, consumed by the very methods that had created it in the first place. But the most significant aspect of this collapse wasn't the end of a particular family's rule. It was the demonstration that the imperial system itself had become larger than any individual dynasty or ruler. When Nero died in 68 CE, the empire didn't collapse into chaos. Instead, it experienced what historians call the Year of the Four Emperors, a brief civil war that ended with the establishment of a new dynasty under the Flavian emperors. The Flavians, led by Vespasian, represented everything that the Claudian dynasty had not been. They were military men from relatively modest backgrounds who had risen through competence and battlefield success rather than through the kind of political manipulation that had characterized their predecessors. But even they found themselves forced to use many of the same techniques that Livy had pioneered, because those techniques had become embedded in the basic structure of how imperial power functioned. Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian, all maintained extensive networks of informants, eliminated potential rivals through various convenient means, and cultivated relationships with key supporters that followed patterns established decades earlier. They were more competent and less paranoid than their Claudian predecessors, but they operated within the same basic system and faced the same fundamental challenges that had shaped Livia's approach to imperial politics. This continuity revealed the true scope of what Livy had accomplished. Her influence on Roman history wasn't limited to the success or failure of her particular family line. She had fundamentally changed how power worked in the ancient world, creating new models for how individuals could exercise authority over complex societies and diverse populations.
The administrative systems that allowed Rome to govern territories from Britain to Mesopotamia incorporated information networks and loyalty relationships that followed patterns she had established. The legal procedures that regulated relationships between different social classes built on precedents set during her conflicts with various imperial rivals. The military command structures that maintained peace across 3 continents relied on the same combination of formal authority and personal relationships that she had used to control politics in the capital. Even more significantly, the cultural expectations that defined how imperial power should be exercised bore her influence. The idea that emperors should be accessible to petitioners, that they should maintain extensive correspondence with provincial governors, that they should intervene personally in legal cases that affected imperial interests. All of these practices trace back to techniques she had developed during Augustus' reign. This institutionalization of her methods meant that subsequent emperors, regardless of their personal qualities or family backgrounds, found themselves operating within frameworks that she had helped create.
The Antonine emperors of the 2nd century CE, widely regarded as some of the most capable and ethical rulers in Roman history, still relied on intelligence networks and loyalty relationships that followed Livian models. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, whose Meditations remain one of the most influential works of ancient ethics, maintained power through techniques that would have been instantly recognizable to someone who had studied Livia's career. He cultivated relationships with key senators, monitored potential threats through extensive networks of informants, and eliminated rivals through methods that maintained plausible deniability while achieving necessary political objectives. The fact that Marcus Aurelius was a genuinely ethical person who struggled with the moral implications of imperial power makes his reliance on these techniques even more significant. It demonstrates that the methods Livia had pioneered weren't just tools for ambitious individuals seeking personal advancement. They had become essential elements of how the imperial system functioned, regardless of who happened to be in charge. This transformation of her personal techniques into institutional necessities had profound implications for Roman society that extended far beyond immediate political consequences. The constant surveillance and manipulation that had once been Livia's signature approach became standard features of daily life throughout the empire. Citizens learned to watch their words in public, monitor their associations carefully, and present different faces to different audiences, depending on what seemed most advantageous at any given moment. The psychological toll of living under these conditions was enormous. Literary sources from the imperial period describe a society where genuine friendship became almost impossible among the educated classes, where trust was a luxury that few could afford, and where paranoia had evolved from a character flaw into a survival skill. But perhaps the most lasting consequence of Livia's influence was how it changed expectations about what political leadership should look like. The Roman Republic had been based on ideals of shared governance, public debate, and collective decision-making among citizens who were presumed to be capable of rational political choices. The imperial system that replaced it was based on the assumption that effective governance required centralized control, exercised by individuals who were willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain stability. This shift in political philosophy wasn't unique to Rome, of course. Similar transformations occurred throughout the ancient world as city-states and tribal confederations gave way to territorial empires that required new forms of organization and control. But Rome's particular version of imperial autocracy, shaped so decisively by Livia's innovations, became the model that subsequent civilizations would study and adapt to their own circumstances. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from Rome's eastern provinces maintained many of the same administrative and intelligence systems that could be traced back to her influence. The Islamic caliphates that conquered much of the former Roman world adopted similar approaches to managing diverse populations and maintaining control over vast territories. Even medieval European kingdoms incorporated elements of the Roman imperial model that bore her fingerprints.
More broadly, Livia's story demonstrates how individual innovations in political technique can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate historical context. The methods she developed for navigating the challenges of her particular situation became part of the basic toolkit that ambitious individuals throughout history have used to acquire and exercise power. The careful cultivation of personal relationships, the strategic use of information and misinformation, the systematic elimination of rivals through methods that maintain plausible deniability, the creation of networks of loyalty that extend throughout existing institutions. All of these approaches can be found in political systems throughout history and across different cultures. This doesn't mean that every subsequent politician consciously modeled their behavior on Livia's example, but rather that she had discovered techniques that were so fundamentally effective for dealing with the basic challenges of political competition that they were independently rediscovered and refined by people facing similar situations. The fact that her methods worked so well in such a wide variety of contexts suggests something important about the nature of power itself. Political authority, regardless of the formal structures that claim to regulate it, ultimately depends on the ability to influence other people's behavior through some combination of incentives and threats. The specific mechanisms may vary depending on technological capabilities and cultural norms, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent across different historical periods and social systems. Livia's genius lay in her understanding of these fundamental dynamics and her willingness to exploit them more systematically and ruthlessly than most of her contemporaries. She recognized that formal political structures were often less important than the informal networks of relationship and influence that actually determined how decisions were made. She understood that information was a form of power that could be accumulated, manipulated, and deployed strategically to achieve specific objectives. Most importantly, she grasped that political competition was ultimately about psychology rather than policy, about the ability to make other people believe that supporting your interests was more advantageous than opposing them. Her success came not from having better ideas about how society should be organized, but from being more effective than her rivals at convincing key individuals that their own interests were best served by advancing her family's position. This psychological dimension of her influence helps explain why her techniques proved so durable and adaptable. The specific technological and institutional contexts of political competition have changed dramatically since the 1st century BCE, but the basic human drives and fears that she learned to manipulate remain largely constant. People still want security, status, and advancement for themselves and their families. They still fear exposure, isolation, and the loss of what they have already achieved. Understanding how to work with these fundamental motivations, how to present yourself as someone who can help others achieve their goals while eliminating those who might threaten them, these skills remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Rome. The methods for gathering and using information have become more sophisticated. The scale of operations has expanded dramatically. But the basic principles that guided Livia's approach to political influence continue to shape how power is exercised in modern societies. This continuity raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between political effectiveness and moral responsibility that are as relevant now as they were 2,000 years ago. Because Livia's story demonstrates clearly that the techniques which are most successful for acquiring and maintaining power are often the same techniques that cause the most harm to the societies where that power is exercised. Her willingness to eliminate rivals, manipulate information, and exploit other people's vulnerabilities made her extraordinarily effective as a political operator. But it also contributed to the creation of a political culture where violence and deception became normalized as tools of governance, where trust became impossible and paranoia became rational. The empire she helped shape was remarkably successful at achieving its basic objectives of maintaining order and prosperity across a vast territory for several centuries. But it was also characterized by levels of surveillance, oppression, and arbitrary violence that ultimately undermined its own legitimacy and contributed to its eventual collapse.
This tension between effectiveness and sustainability, between short-term success and long-term stability, appears throughout history whenever societies face the choice between accepting flawed but functional leadership and risking chaos in pursuit of more ethical alternatives. Livia's story provides one of the clearest examples of both the potential benefits and the ultimate costs of choosing effectiveness over ethical constraints in political life. The woman who began as a teenage refugee fleeing civil war ended up creating a template for political success that would influence governance systems throughout the ancient world and beyond. Her techniques worked so well that they became permanent features of how power was exercised in her society. But they also created contradictions and instabilities that would eventually consume the very dynasty she had worked so hard to establish. Perhaps that's the most important lesson her story teaches about the nature of political ambition and its consequences. Individual success in political competition often requires methods that undermine the broader social cooperation that successful societies depend on. The skills that make someone effective at gaining power are frequently the same skills that make them dangerous as actual rulers. Livia Drusilla achieved everything she set out to accomplish through intelligence, patience, and an absolute commitment to advancing her family's interests, regardless of the human cost. But her success created a political system where no one, including her own descendants, could ever be completely safe from the methods she had pioneered. She won the game of imperial politics so thoroughly that she transformed the rules of that game in ways that made her victory ultimately meaningless. The dynasty she established was consumed by the very techniques that had created it, and the empire she helped shape was built on foundations that guaranteed its eventual collapse. Yet her influence on human history remains profound and lasting. Not because her particular solutions to political challenges were inherently good or bad, but because they were so remarkably effective at achieving their intended purposes.
Understanding her story helps us recognize similar patterns in our own political systems and forces us to confront difficult questions about the relationship between means and ends in public life. The Serpent Empress of Rome had indeed changed the world. But whether that change represented progress or decline depends entirely on how we weigh immediate effectiveness against long-term consequences, individual success against social stability, and political achievement against moral responsibility. These are questions that every generation must answer for itself. But Livia's example provides a uniquely clear illustration of what's at stake in making those choices. Her legacy lives on not just in the historical record, but in the continuing relevance of the fundamental challenges she faced and the methods she developed to address them. The specific context of first-century Roman politics may seem remote from contemporary concerns, but the basic dynamics of power, influence, and ambition that shaped her career remain as relevant today as they were 2 millennia ago. And that perhaps is the most unsettling aspect of her story, because it suggests that the problems she solved through systematic manipulation and elimination weren't unique products of her particular historical moment, but rather permanent features of political life that every society must somehow address. The question isn't whether her methods were right or wrong, but whether more ethical alternatives can be equally effective at achieving necessary political objectives. That's a question that remains unanswered.
and Livia Drusilla's extraordinary career stands as both an inspiration and a warning about what's possible when intelligence and ambition are unleashed without moral constraints to guide their application. The reverberations of Livia's influence extended far beyond her immediate family and reached into every corner of Roman society in ways that would have shocked even her. Because while the Claudian dynasty eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, the political culture she had created continued to evolve and adapt, finding new expressions in each generation of rulers who followed. Take Vespasian, the pragmatic military commander who emerged victorious from the chaos of 68 CE. Here was a man who represented everything the aristocratic Livia would have despised. He came from a middle-class Italian family, spoke with a provincial accent, and made jokes about his own humble origins. When he was on his deathbed, he reportedly quipped that he must be turning into a god, mocking the divine pretensions that had consumed his predecessors. Yet even this down-to-earth soldier found himself using techniques that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Livia's playbook. Within months of becoming emperor, Vespasian had established his own network of informants throughout the provinces, eliminated potential rivals through a series of convenient military accidents, and begun cultivating relationships with key senators, using exactly the same combination of favor and fear that had made his predecessor so effective. The difference was in execution rather than method. Where Livia had operated through whispered conversations and subtle manipulation, Vespasian preferred direct confrontation and obvious intimidation. When a senator named Helvidius Priscus began challenging imperial authority in philosophical debates, Vespasian didn't bother with poison or manufactured scandals. He simply had the man executed and dared anyone to complain about it. But the underlying logic was identical to what Livia had pioneered decades earlier. Identify threats before they become dangerous. Eliminate them through whatever means prove most effective. And make sure the lesson isn't lost on potential future opponents. The only real innovation was Vespasian's willingness to be more open about what he was doing, reflecting a political culture that had become so accustomed to imperial violence that subtlety was no longer necessary. His son, Titus, took this evolution one step further by transforming systematic brutality into public entertainment. The opening of the Colosseum in 80 CE wasn't just about providing spectacles for the Roman people. It was about demonstrating imperial power through carefully orchestrated displays of controlled violence. The gladiatorial games that became synonymous with Roman civilization were essentially Livian techniques scaled up and turned into mass entertainment. Think about what those games actually represented. Condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and social outcasts were forced to fight and die for the amusement of crowds who understood that they were watching demonstrations of what happened to people who challenged imperial authority. The emperor's thumb deciding whether a defeated gladiator lived or died was a perfect metaphor for how political power actually worked in the system Livia had helped create. But it was under Domitian, Vespasian's youngest son, that the psychological dimensions of Livia's legacy became fully apparent. Here was an emperor who had grown up watching his father and brother exercise power through carefully calibrated displays of strength and mercy. He understood that effective imperial rule required more than just the ability to eliminate enemies. It demanded the creation of a political atmosphere where potential enemies eliminated themselves through fear and anticipation. Domitian perfected what we might call the theater of paranoia. He held regular meetings with senators where he would sit in silence, studying their faces and taking notes, never explaining what he was looking for, but making it clear that everyone was being evaluated. He established a system of rewards for informants that encouraged Romans to report on their neighbors, friends, and family members for suspicious behavior that was never clearly defined. Most brilliantly, he made extensive use of what contemporary sources called the datio, essentially legalized extortion, where ambitious individuals could advance their careers by accusing others of treason. The accused would be tried in secret proceedings where the evidence was rarely revealed and the outcomes seemed to depend more on political considerations than legal facts. This system created exactly the kind of self-reinforcing cycle of suspicion and betrayal that Livia had used to control Augustus's court, but scaled up to encompass the entire empire.
Citizens learned that survival required not just avoiding actual disloyalty, but avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as potentially disloyal by people whose motivations and standards were deliberately kept mysterious. The psychological toll was enormous. Pliny the Younger, writing decades later, described the atmosphere during Domitian's reign as one of constant terror, where even private conversations were conducted in whispers, and where friends avoided each other to prevent any appearance of conspiracy. The Roman elite, once confident in their social positions and political influence, found themselves reduced to trembling courtiers who competed with each other to demonstrate their abject submission to imperial authority. But what made this system so effective was how it turned traditional Roman virtues into liabilities. Courage became recklessness when it might be interpreted as defiance. Friendship became dangerous when it might suggest divided loyalties. Intelligence became threatening when it might imply criticism of imperial policies. The qualities that had once made someone valuable to the Republic now made them suspicious under the Empire. This inversion of values wasn't accidental. It was a logical extension of the political culture that Livia had pioneered. In a system where power was personal rather than institutional, where loyalty to the emperor mattered more than competence or virtue, it made perfect sense to view traditional aristocratic qualities as potential threats rather than assets. The result was a society that became increasingly hollow at its core, maintaining the external forms of Roman civilization while abandoning the underlying principles that had made that civilization worth preserving. The Senate still met and debated, but only on issues that the emperor had already decided. The courts still functioned, but their verdicts reflected political necessities rather than legal principles. The military still conquered new territories, but increasingly they served as tools for maintaining internal control rather than expanding Roman power. This hollowing out of Roman institutions reached its logical conclusion under Domitian's successors. The so-called five good emperors who ruled during the 2nd century CE. These men, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, are often celebrated as the pinnacle of Roman achievement, presiding over an era of peace, prosperity, and cultural flourishing that has never been matched in human history. But their success was built entirely on the foundation that Livia had established 2 centuries earlier. They maintained power through the same networks of information and influence,
eliminated threats through the same combination of legal manipulation and convenient accidents, and cultivated loyalty through the same careful balance of rewards and punishments that she had perfected. The difference was that they were more competent and less paranoid than their predecessors, able to use these techniques more effectively because they weren't constantly worried about their own security. But the techniques themselves remained unchanged, and their effectiveness continued to depend on the willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a serious challenge to imperial authority. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose personal writings reveal a man genuinely struggling with the moral implications of absolute power, still found himself ordering the execution of potential rivals and maintaining surveillance networks that monitored the private lives of Roman citizens. His philosophical meditations on virtue and duty coexisted with political practices that would have been instantly recognizable to someone who had studied Livia's methods. This contradiction between personal morality and political necessity wasn't a failure of character. It was an inevitable consequence of operating within the system she had created. Even the most ethical individuals found themselves forced to use unethical methods because those methods had become institutionalized as necessary elements of effective governance. The long-term consequences of this institutionalization became apparent during the 3rd century crisis, when the empire nearly collapsed under the weight of civil wars, economic disruption, and foreign invasions. The political culture that had worked so well for maintaining stability during periods of strength proved completely inadequate for dealing with genuine existential threats. The problem wasn't that individual emperors lacked competence or courage, but that the system itself had become dependent on techniques that worked only as long as the empire remained overwhelmingly powerful relative to its enemies. When that advantage disappeared, the networks of loyalty and fear that held the system together began to break down, creating a cascade of failures that nearly destroyed Roman civilization entirely. The crisis was eventually resolved through the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, but their solution involved essentially abandoning the political system that Livia had helped create and replacing it with something that was Roman in name only. The late empire that emerged from their efforts was a completely different kind of state, more resembling the Persian despotism that early Romans had despised than the republic their ancestors had created. But even in this transformed context, elements of Livia's influence persisted. The Byzantine Empire that survived in the East for another 1,000 years maintained many of the same administrative practices and intelligence systems that could be traced back to her innovations. The elaborate court ceremonies and secret police networks that characterized medieval Constantinople were direct descendants of techniques she had pioneered in Augustus's household. More broadly, her influence can be detected in the political systems that emerged throughout the former Roman world. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced imperial authority in Western Europe adopted many Roman administrative practices, including the use of informant networks and strategic elimination of rivals that had become standard features of imperial governance. The Islamic caliphates that conquered much of the former Roman territory in the 7th and 8th centuries similarly incorporated elements of the Roman imperial model, adapting surveillance and control techniques that bore clear resemblances to methods Livia had developed for managing diverse populations and maintaining centralized authority over vast territories. Even the medieval Catholic Church, which claimed to represent a completely different set of values than those that had motivated imperial politics, found itself using remarkably similar techniques for maintaining institutional unity and eliminating internal dissent.
The papal inquisitions of later centuries employed information networks and elimination strategies that would have been familiar to anyone who had studied Roman imperial practices. This continuity across different cultures, religions, and historical periods suggests something important about the nature of political power itself. The specific techniques that Livia developed weren't unique products of Roman civilization. They were solutions to fundamental challenges that any complex political system must somehow address. How do you maintain loyalty among subordinates who have their own interests and ambitions? How do you identify and neutralize threats before they become dangerous? How do you balance the need for competent administrators against the risk that competence might translate into independence? These questions don't have easy answers, and the methods that prove most effective for addressing them often involve exactly the kind of manipulation and elimination that characterized Livia's approach. The fact that similar techniques have been independently developed by political systems throughout history suggests that they represent something like natural laws of political competition. Just as biological evolution tends to produce similar solutions to environmental challenges in different species, political evolution seems to produce similar solutions to governance challenges in different societies. This doesn't make those solutions morally acceptable, but it does help explain why they appear so consistently across different contexts. The methods work because they address real problems that political systems face, and they persist because alternatives that are more ethically appealing often prove less effective at achieving necessary objectives. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for evaluating Livia's historical significance. She wasn't a uniquely evil individual who corrupted an otherwise pure political system. She was an extraordinarily capable person who discovered and perfected techniques that were latent possibilities within any complex political organization. Her genius lay not in inventing entirely new forms of political manipulation, but in recognizing the potential of existing practices and systematizing them into a coherent approach that could be applied consistently across different situations. She took techniques that others had used sporadically and intuitively and transformed them into a systematic methodology that could be taught, learned, and refined by subsequent generations. The result was a form of political knowledge that proved remarkably durable and adaptable, capable of being modified to fit different technological capabilities and cultural contexts while maintaining its essential characteristics. The specific methods evolved, but the underlying principles remained constant because they were based on accurate observations about human psychology and social dynamics. This is what makes her story so relevant to contemporary political analysis. The formal structures of modern democratic systems are obviously very different from those of the Roman Empire, but the basic challenges of political competition and governance remain remarkably similar. People still want security, status, and advancement for themselves and their families. They still respond to incentives and threats in predictable ways. They still form networks of loyalty and mutual support that can be influenced through strategic intervention. Modern political operatives may use polling data instead of informant networks, media manipulation instead of whispered rumors, and legal challenges instead of poison. But the underlying logic of their activities often bears striking resemblances to techniques that Livia pioneered 2,000 years ago. The scale has expanded and the methods have become more sophisticated, but the basic principles remain recognizable. This continuity raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between democratic ideals and political reality that democratic societies have never fully resolved.
Because the methods that prove most effective for winning elections and maintaining power in democratic systems often involve exactly the kind of manipulation and deception that Livia used to advance her family's interests in imperial Rome, the cultivation of loyal networks, the strategic use of information and misinformation, the systematic undermining of rivals through personal attacks and scandal, the creation of fear and uncertainty among potential opponents. All of these approaches can be found in contemporary political campaigns and governmental operations throughout the democratic world. The difference is primarily one of scale and openness rather than fundamental technique. Modern political systems provide more opportunities for opposition and criticism than the Roman Empire ever did, but they also provide more sophisticated tools for manipulation and control that would have impressed even someone with Livia's capabilities. The result is political cultures that often seem to combine the worst aspects of both democratic and autocratic systems, maintaining the formal procedures of representative government while incorporating the psychological manipulation and strategic elimination that characterized imperial politics. This hybrid character helps explain why so many contemporary political systems seem simultaneously more open and more oppressive than their historical predecessors. Citizens have more formal rights and legal protections than ever before, but they also face more subtle and pervasive forms of surveillance that make traditional concepts of privacy and autonomy increasingly meaningless. The techniques that Livia developed for managing a single imperial court have been scaled up and systematized to manage entire populations through methods that are more effective precisely because they are less obvious than the crude violence that characterized ancient tyranny. Modern surveillance states don't need to execute dissidents when they can destroy their reputations, eliminate their employment opportunities, and isolate them socially through techniques that maintain plausible deniability while achieving the same practical objectives that physical elimination once served. Similarly, modern political leaders don't need to poison rivals when they can destroy them through strategic leaks, manufactured scandals, and legal prosecutions that serve political purposes while maintaining the appearance of procedural legitimacy. These developments represent the logical evolution of techniques that Livia pioneered, adapted to technological capabilities and cultural expectations that didn't exist in her time, but refined according to principles she would have immediately recognized and approved. The woman who started as a teenage refugee and ended up reshaping the ancient world through systematic manipulation and strategic elimination had indeed created something that transcended her particular historical circumstances.
Her methods proved so effective at addressing fundamental challenges of political competition that they became permanent features of how power is exercised in complex societies. Whether this represents progress or decline in human political development depends entirely on how we weigh immediate effectiveness against long-term consequences, individual success against social cohesion, and political achievement against moral responsibility. But what's undeniable is that Livia Drusilla's influence on human history extends far beyond the rise and fall of the Claudian dynasty or even the Roman Empire itself. She discovered and systematized approaches to political power that have shaped governance systems throughout history and continue to influence how political competition is conducted in the modern world. Her story forces us to confront difficult questions about the nature of political leadership and the relationship between the methods that prove most effective for gaining power and the values that make societies worth preserving. These questions don't have easy answers, but understanding how one remarkably capable individual addressed them provides crucial insights into challenges that every generation of political leaders must somehow resolve.
The Serpent Empress of Rome had indeed changed the world, but the full implications of that change are still unfolding in political systems throughout the contemporary world. Her techniques have evolved and adapted, but their essential characteristics remain recognizable to anyone who studies how power actually works beneath the surface of formal political institutions. That may be her most lasting legacy, the demonstration that political reality often bears little resemblance to political theory, and that the methods which prove most effective for achieving political objectives are often the methods that do the most damage to the societies where those objectives are pursued. Understanding this contradiction is essential for anyone who wants to comprehend how political systems actually function. And Livia's extraordinary career provides one of the clearest historical examples of both the potential and the dangers of choosing effectiveness over ethical constraints in the pursuit of political power. Her legacy wasn't just about changing how one empire functioned. The techniques she perfected became a template that ambitious individuals would study and adapt across centuries and continents. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the story of Wu Tan, the only woman to ever officially hold the title of emperor in Chinese history. Wu Tan lived 6 centuries after Livia's death in a completely different culture with entirely different political structures. Yet, when you examine her rise to power, the parallels are so striking they could have been deliberately copied from a manual. She began as a low-ranking concubine in the Tang imperial court, someone who should have remained invisible in the vast bureaucracy of the Chinese palace system. But Wu Tan had studied power the same way Livia had, understanding that formal positions mattered less than the ability to make yourself indispensable to the right people. She cultivated relationships with key eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor. She gathered information about rival concubines and used it strategically to eliminate competition. Most importantly, she recognized that in a system where women were supposed to be powerless, the appearance of powerlessness could become a weapon. When Emperor Tong died, Wu was supposed to be sent to a Buddhist convent to live out her days in religious seclusion. Instead, she had already begun an affair with the dead emperor's son, who would become Emperor Gaozong. Within 2 years, she had maneuvered herself from exile back to the center of imperial power as the new emperor's favored consort. What happened next was pure Livian methodology applied to Chinese court politics. Wu systematically eliminated every woman who stood between her and the position of empress. The existing empress and her main rival both died under circumstances that were officially attributed to natural causes, but occurred with timing so convenient that even contemporary Chinese historians openly speculated about poison. But Wu's masterstroke was how she managed to make Emperor Gaozong complicit in her rise to power. Rather than simply replacing his existing wife, she convinced him that the deaths of his other consorts were actually attempts by palace enemies to frame her for murder. She positioned herself as the victim of a conspiracy rather than its architect, making the emperor her protector rather than her obstacle. The psychological manipulation was brilliant. Gaozong found himself defending Wu against accusations that she had orchestrated, turning her enemies into his enemies and making her survival essential to his own credibility. When she finally became empress, it appeared to be his decision to reward loyalty rather than her achievement in eliminating competition. Once she held the title, Wu began expanding her influence using techniques that would have impressed even Livia. She established networks of informants throughout the imperial bureaucracy, created new government positions that she filled with her supporters, and began systematically removing officials who had served the previous administration.
But what made Wu truly dangerous was her understanding of how to use ideology as a political weapon. She didn't just eliminate rivals. She reframed the entire philosophical basis of imperial rule to justify her actions. She promoted Buddhism over Confucianism because Buddhist teachings were more accepting of female authority. She commissioned new translations of religious texts that emphasized the legitimacy of female leadership. She even claimed to be the reincarnation of a Buddhist deity destined to rule China. This ideological dimension of her power was something Livia had never attempted. The Roman system was too pragmatic and too focused on personal relationships to support that kind of systematic reframing of basic political assumptions. But Wu recognized the Chinese culture's emphasis on cosmic harmony and divine mandate created opportunities that could be exploited by someone clever enough to manipulate religious and philosophical concepts. The result was a reign that lasted over 40 years and fundamentally changed how political power was understood in East Asian civilization. Wu didn't just rule as a woman. She created new precedents for how women could exercise authority that influenced political systems throughout the region for centuries afterward. But the most chilling aspect of her story was what happened to her own family. Just like Livia, Wu discovered that the methods she used to gain power made it impossible to trust anyone, including her own children. She had 3 sons executed for allegedly plotting against her rule, eliminated numerous relatives who might have posed threats to her authority, and created a palace atmosphere where paranoia became the only rational response to court politics. When she finally died at age 81, she had achieved everything Livy had accomplished, and more. She had ruled an empire directly rather than through male relatives, established a dynasty that would influence Chinese politics for generations, and created new models for female political authority that would be studied and copied throughout Asia. Yet her legacy was equally ambiguous. The techniques that made her so successful as an individual ruler contributed to the creation of a political culture where systematic surveillance, ideological conformity, and the elimination of dissent became standard features of imperial governance. The Chinese bureaucratic state that emerged from her reign was remarkably effective at maintaining control over vast populations. But it was also characterized by levels of social control that made individual autonomy virtually impossible. This pattern of individual success creating systemic problems repeated itself throughout history, wherever Livian techniques were applied. Consider Catherine de' Medici, who used remarkably similar methods to maintain power during the French Wars of Religion in the 16th century. She manipulated religious conflicts to eliminate political rivals, used networks of informants to monitor potential threats, and systematically eliminated anyone who challenged her family's authority. Catherine's approach was adapted to the specific circumstances of Renaissance France, where religious division provided opportunities that hadn't existed in either Roman or Chinese contexts. She played Catholic and Protestant factions against each other, using theological disputes to justify political eliminations while positioning herself as the defender of royal authority against religious extremism. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, where thousands of Protestant leaders were killed in a coordinated attack that Catherine had helped orchestrate, was essentially a scaled-up version of the techniques Livy had used to eliminate Augustus's heirs. The difference was that Catherine could use religious justification to make mass murder appear as necessary defense of social order, rather than personal ambition. But the long-term consequences were equally destructive. The political culture that Catherine helped create contributed to the breakdown of feudal authority structures and the eventual collapse of the French monarchy and revolution.
The techniques that had seemed so effective for maintaining power in the short term created instabilities that would ultimately destroy the system they were designed to protect.
This pattern suggests something important about the nature of political power itself. The methods that prove most effective for gaining and maintaining authority in complex societies often contain the seeds of their own destruction. They work brilliantly for individual practitioners, but they create cultural and institutional changes that make long-term stability impossible. Livia had discovered this contradiction in her own lifetime, watching as the techniques that elevated her family to imperial power made it impossible for that family to maintain unity or trust. Her successors throughout history would face the same dilemma, achieving remarkable individual success while contributing to the breakdown of the very systems that had made their success possible. So there you have it, Livia Drusilla, the woman who started as a 19-year-old refugee and ended up creating the blueprint for political power that would echo through millennia. She didn't just change Rome, she changed how power itself works in human civilization. Her methods became so embedded in political systems worldwide that we're still living with the consequences today. The Serpent Empress had won the ultimate victory, one that transcended empires, dynasties, and even death itself.